Hey guys, welcome back. And today we'll be taking a look at the Sony 16mm f2.8 Pancake Lens for APS-C. I bought this lens for about $100 used off eBay, but it retails for just $250 brand new. This is partially because this is a very old lens, back from the Sony NEX years. That being said, it is still fully compatible with their current Alpha series of APS-C cameras. In the box, you're going to find some literature and the lens itself, along with the lens caps. I bought my copy used and do not have the original packaging. This lens features an all-metal aluminum body, including the mount, and only comes in this metallic finish. The front part is black, however, creating a nice contrast with the silver, and here you'll also find the very small front glass element. The materials chosen give it a nice amount of durability, but it still doesn't feel as solid as something like the Sigma 16mm, and the finish makes it look kind of cheap, which, to be fair, it is. Where this lens really shines is its minuscule size and weight. It'll easily fit in any pocket, as it is, after all, a pancake lens. The design of this lens is very simple. A single control ring for focus, which is electronically linked to the focus motor. While smooth to turn, it doesn't feel very well damped or refined as a more premium option. It is responsive enough though, and I can't really complain too much. Focusing is fully internal, and the lens does have autofocus, but I've had major problems with it, more on that later. Optical image stabilization, however, is absent, which isn't terribly surprising for the size and price point. It is, however, kind of a big deal for this lens's target audience. More on that later. Overall, very simple but mostly adequate construction. As you probably know, this lens has a very wide angle of 16mm, or on APS-C, the 35mm equivalent of 24mm. This is a nice wide angle, but not what I would consider ultra wide, as with something like a Rokinon 12mm. This lens does allow you to get some mildly dramatic shots, especially of interior rooms, making them look wide and expansive. Aside from that, the focal length is just a good general purpose length, which, to me, while slightly boring, makes this lens quite useful, especially considering that you can just throw it in a pocket with its size. The 7 electronically controlled rounded aperture blades that open as wide as f2.8 allow a decent amount of light in, and allow for some mild bokeh, but as seems to be a theme with this lens, it is by no means special, and others out there do it much better here. The Sigma 16mm opens as bright as f1.4, for example. Additionally, the quality of what limited bokeh you can get leaves something to be desired. It often has weird highlighting and hard, busy outlines, leading to a somewhat unpleasant look. Here's an example of this lens's performance at its minimum focusing distance of 9.45 inches, which is about 24 centimeters for those of you in metric. This is the maximum size of a quarter in frame. As you can see, not exactly a macro lens. At its minimum focusing distance, sharpness also seems to suffer quite a bit, as we can see from zooming in, although we are at f2.8. Not terribly impressive. In terms of vignetting, it's not a great showing either. Using the same image, we can see that without in-camera corrections, there is a somewhat shocking amount of vignetting. While this will be automatically corrected in the real world, whether by your camera or Photoshop, it may impact corner photo quality. And speaking of which, let's take a look at our sharpness results. Alrighty guys, now we're going to take a look at sharpness, starting at, of course, f2.8, which is wide open. Coming to the center, we can see that we actually start somewhat sharp. It's not perfect, but it is definitely quite serviceably sharp. We're at 1:1 by the way. Coming to the As you can see, this top left corner has seen much better days. In fact, this is definitely one of the worst showings I've seen out of any lens I have, and it may be one of the worst lenses out there. Coming to the right corner, we see something interesting. It's certainly not pretty, but it is actually significantly better than the top left corner. And what that tells us is that this lens either has poor quality control or we got a lemon in that it's not well centered. Now, if we come back to the center here, coming to f4, the center is actually now very sharp. This is near perfectly sharp. So the center started pretty good and improved very quickly, and it's not going to get sharper than this. So that's very good showing in the center, but back to the corners, we see that we're still not doing so hot. It only sharpened up a little bit, it seems, and it's still quite bad. Now f6.3, there was actually a significant jump in sharpness. I don't know if you guys caught that, but it's still not good. But now I would say that it is at least usable. It's not good, but it's usably sharp. f8 now. Once again sharpened up quite a bit. So now we're getting into somewhat decent sharpness. It's still not sharp though. f11, once again sharpened up a little bit. And then of course as we stop down, f16 is similar to f11, but especially as we come down to f22, diffraction definitely kicks in and softens up our image quite a bit. So overall, definitely not a great showing here. It's quite disappointing because a 16mm lens is used for something like landscapes, and in applications like that you definitely want your edge-to-edge sharpness, unlike in something like portraits where you wouldn't need that, but you can't really do portraits with a 16mm lens. But yeah, obviously sharpening was off, and if we come down here, we do have distortion and vignetting corrections on, so keep that in mind. Now, moving on to what is more bad news for this lens, unfortunately, distortion. We have our corrections for distortion turned off here. Don't worry about vignetting. This is a computer screen, so it's not an accurate sample, although, as you could probably tell from that previous photo, it is quite bad. But that's not the topic, we're talking about distortion. As you can see, it seems like pincushion distortion at first, until you look at it, and you look up here, and it seems to be almost this wavy type of distortion. Kind of comes down, in, and then up again. So it's very interesting. It is correctable, just like the vignetting, but once again, it may have an impact on image quality during that correction, especially if it's a severe correction. This is certainly not the worst distortion I've seen, so it's not horrible, but it's certainly not what I would call a good performance here. Fortunately for this lens, as you can tell in the direct sun, it does not suffer from any flaring issues. The flaring is very gentle and barely noticeable. As for focus breathing, which you video makers may care about, more good news. This lens exhibits very little of it. Now onto a major problem area, autofocus. I'm not sure if I got a defective copy of this lens, or if it's just an old and bad design, but this lens has extremely jerky and jittery autofocus, even if it's decently accurate. As you can see, it's not horribly slow, but it is very unsure of itself, immediately ruling out any sort of action photography. It would, however, be usable for more general purpose and casual work, though it would get very frustrating very quickly. Fortunately, that mostly clears up in video mode, where it has usably fast and decently accurate autofocus with only minor hunting. Finally, let's talk stabilization. Being a cheap, portable lens, this may be at the top of a list for someone like an aspiring vlogger or just a beginning video maker, but without image stabilization built in, is it up to the task? Of course, the more expensive A6500 has IBIS, but what about cheaper alternatives like my A6400? And what about those who can't afford something like a gimbal? As you can tell, despite the wide focal length, the shake is still noticeable and quite distracting. If walking, you'd be better off using an iPhone than this unstabilized rig. This really is a shame because everything leading up to this, the size, the weight, the price, the focal length, all point to this being a really nice entry vlogging lens. However, without that stabilization, is it really worth it? Because if you have to spend more for stabilization, then you might as well just get a better lens. So, time to wrap things up. Overall, this lens has really been a mixed bag. There are some major positives, a dirt cheap price when used, decent build quality, and a tiny form factor. But it also has a slew of problems, including mediocre autofocus, poor sharpness, and lack of stabilization. Personally, I would not recommend this lens for most people. It may be suitable for those on an extreme budget or as a first lens, but if it must come to it, it can be had for just $100 used, and it will do its job. it just won't do it terribly well. I personally would rather save up $200 more and get something like the excellent Sigma 16mm f1.4, review coming soon by the way, still a relatively affordable lens. I made the mistake of buying this lens, lured in by the low price, and have since upgraded, so hopefully you don't make the same mistake I did. It may be a decent value used for $100, but I wouldn't even consider buying it for $250. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for more camera gear and lens reviews.